These past years we have seen plenty of remakes and remasters of multiple video games, but the questions are, why? What are the differences between them? Is the industry getting stuck with these ideas? Let's discuss these and more topics about them. So, what are the differences between them? Now, this can be confusing for a lot of people because companies most of times don't really care to explain these kinds of things. And then we have a lot of names like Remake, Remaster, HD Edition, Redux, Reloaded, Reignited, Definitive, etc, etc. And sometimes fans don't entirely agree with some definitions or when a certain game is thrown into a specific category. And I don't blame anyone if you have no idea what all of those names mean. So let me share some examples and try to keep things simple to move to different topics. A remake is a game where they take a general idea and pretty much do everything from scratch, but trying to keep the same thing. That means having new code, another engine, changing some basic ideas, and that's pretty much about it. As examples we could throw Resident Evil 4 Remake, Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, Star Ocean The Second Story R, Witch Spring Heart, Dead Space, and Etran Odyssey The Millennium Girl. A remake is pretty much the polar opposite. You have a game, and you need to make it fit in a place where most likely it is not going to work, so visuals, music, and other things get downgraded. If you've been into video games for quite some time, probably the first thing to come into mind are arcade games. In my case, one I will never forget is Killer Instinct. There are plenty of differences between the arcade version and SNES version. And with this idea in mind, pretty much everything that was thrown into the Game Boy Color, DS, and so on was a remake, sometimes being entirely different things. The most confusing thing here is when companies say remake, but what they actually mean is a reboot or reimagine, which is also taking inspiration from something, but adding more changes, like different stories, different gameplay, plus the previous things as code and so on. In this case, that's pretty much what happened with Final Fantasy VII Remake, Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake. It could be said that Doom 2016 is a reboot, same as Tomb Raider. The idea is there, but plenty of things have been changed. And in general, a remaster is where they just improve graphics and move on, like Castlevania Advance Collection, Room Factory 4 HD, Etran Odyssey HD, Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition, Bravely Default HD, Operation Abyss or Babel, Wisman's World Retry, etc, etc. As you can see, this is where we can throw the bombastic names, such as Reloaded, Reignited, Redux HD, and so on. Unfortunately, the fact that they say HD doesn't exactly mean they are good looking, which is the case of plenty of them, but more of that later. Of course, the confusing thing with remasters comes with ports, but the essence of a port is that the game was originally made for a console, let's say PSP. Then it is just adapted to play in something different, like what we saw in the video about unoptimized video games. Resident Evil 4 is the perfect example because this game is pretty much everywhere. So going through the basics, those are the differences between one another. But then again, this is just a simplified explanation because there are a lot of names and contradictions and clarifications in between. At the end of the day, companies, fans, and experts have different opinions, and of course this is just my grain of salt in all of this mess. With this, the idea is to keep things as civilized as possible, so even when you hear a cynic or an ironic comment, the idea is not to offend. So, why do companies bring remakes, remasters, and so on in the first place? It is easy. To make money. You, the player, may have a deep connection with a particular experience, a particular journey, but for most companies in turn, eso se la pela. In other words, most of times money is going to be the main drive, and cash flow is the most important thing. When there is a lot of uncertainty, the easiest bet is to bring something that is known. Some people point to remakes and remasters as a kind of poison, that there's nothing new under the sun, and that companies run out of ideas. And then you have me saying, remakes and remasters aren't the issue. Plenty of companies ran out of ideas for quite some time, otherwise we wouldn't have so many sequels. Do I need to remind you how many Mega Man games are out there? How many Resident Evils? Monster Hunters? Pokémon's, FIFA's, Call of Duty's, Castlevania's, Gears of War's, Halo's, Final Fantasy, Shin Megami Tensei, Persona, etc, etc. The list is big as heck. People who play a lot of video games ask for innovation, but sometimes the main idea is that the game is just slightly adapted through games and that's it. There are series where people say, if you have played one, you have played everything. As proof of this, and even when I really like the game, you won't let me lie, Metaphor took the main ideas from Shin Megami Tensei, Persona and other RPGs out there, and that's it. Even its soundtrack, which was praised, took inspiration from A Strange Journey, detail pointed when I reviewed the game. Expedition 33 took inspiration from Persona, Final Fantasy and so on, and also had an amazing reception. Of course, I am just pointing that when you have played plenty of video games, few things out there really innovate. That doesn't mean they are bad, but yeah, sometimes we don't make sense when we ask for innovation and keep on playing the same or similar ideas again and again. If we talk about pure innovation, the indie realm is where amazing ideas get cooked. Needless to say that you will have to find them, like your mother. And I don't blame people for overlooking these details and point at remakes and remasters as the main problem. Now, I am not super clever. If I were to make an RPG, to be honest, I will borrow ideas from here and there. So, in easy terms, to me, plenty of companies run out of ideas for quite some time, and betting for something known is easier than bringing something entirely new to the table, because when human beings see something wacky, out of the ordinary, their first reaction is hesitation. At the end of the day, it is easier to say Silent Hill 1, 2, 3 than, I don't know, where sinners redeem. Of course, the fact that companies run out of ideas and start recycling mechanics doesn't mean everything has been lost. Recycling mechanics and things like that isn't that big of a deal when the setting and directions are amazing. But okay, we cannot really fix this part of the industry. Remakes and remasters will keep appearing left and right. The questions may be, is it worth playing them? No idea. At the end of the day, there are different groups who will share their piece. So let's start with the most ironic, where they say that there's no need to have any remake or remaster, knowing that you can play the originals. Here's where I ask, do you have the console, a specific TV, and game at hand? If that is not the case, then go out there and find them. I guess your parents are to blame for planning, or maybe not having you in 2005. Yikes. This is definitely the most extreme group, because they want you to know plenty of little differences. Now, in the video about tips to make a collection, I already covered some of the basics when it comes to consoles. Yeah, the video is all over the place, maybe in the future I'll remaster it, I don't know. But yeah, going through the trouble to find the specific version of a console, a game, can be a nightmare in some cases. Plus the money you will have to pay for some of those copies. Another group says that you can find the definitive editions in PC. Fortunately here, you don't need dumb examples, like what was exposed in the unoptimized games. Good hardware from 10 years ago works fine. That is of course if you get a thing or two about computers, and if you know relatively safe places where you can download what is required to play the game, because having the original game isn't everything. You need to consider patches and other things to fix certain experiences, otherwise you're doing it wrong. Now, I don't want to dive that much into these two specific topics, because it may be worth talking about them in other video. The point here is that sometimes people aren't that good with technology. For example, where I work, plenty of people struggle when their computers start to fail, having to fully rely in the IT department. And yes, if you have seen some of my videos, sometimes they have interesting takes about video games, or sometimes they are the ones who inspire me to talk about these kinds of things. It is easy to say, yeah, you can learn, but what if they don't have the time, money or energy to go through those problems? Allow me to clarify this with another example. There are some Japanese games that have been on my radar, either because they have better collector's editions, or because most likely they will never come here. In any case, how obnoxious and dumb do you think it would be if I said, oh yeah, go learn Japanese, otherwise you're not a fan, I guess? It sounds simple, but unfortunately it is not that simple. Okay, then there is another group who says, remakes and remasters are the definitive editions, there is no need to keep the old-dated versions. Ironically, sometimes this group can be as loud as the one who asks you to get classy tech to play a game. So what can I say? Sure, you can share an opinion, but without knowing or having played the original, it is questionable, at least if they go over the top with flashy words. And then you have dumped me where sure, I have the original hardware, a decent computer, but doesn't have the time to sometimes look for specific things. so playing a remaster or a remake is the least of issues. Now, as you can see, we could throw irony after irony again and again. I could talk about the art and direction of some video games, where also fans defend them as if trying to protect the last bastion of humanity. But it is also ironic when artistic directors come out and say, yeah, it is trash, we did what we could, or completely ignore their games as works of art. But it is fair to say that some games definitely feel different, at least knowing that there was attention to detail, as we already shared, Shadow of the Colossus or Demon's Souls. Now, should remakes and remasters exist? In my humble opinion, they are a nice way to fix issues of the past, or to rebalance certain things. For example, you know I love the RPGs, and Etrian Odyssey is one of my favorite IPs, but I cannot push people to try the DS releases. Yes, in this channel I encourage people to try challenges for themselves, but knowing damn well that even experienced players sweat blood once they reach late dungeons, then it doesn't make that much sense from my side to push people there. I could say the same thing for Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey, another game that plenty of people left in the shelf, because the DS release is simply a nightmare. Eridanus was a nightmare, but things just go downhill from there. So once again, rebalancing things for a slightly easier retry is better in these cases. We could debate with some other entries, where sure, ideally, challenges should be left intact as challenges. I mean, comparing the difficulty between these two games is like day and night. Some definitely need them, while others dilute the experience. Here it is fair to say that I like to collect physical things, so you can find many games in Steam or through other means, but I prefer to have a copy in my hands. It doesn't matter if I ended up hating what these companies have done. Other release that felt extraordinary was the Castlevania Advance Collection. I have played one, but the other two were not in my radar, so having the chance to get these releases where you can do a lot of things is amazing. Same principle applies for this forgotten game. It is ironic that it was released in this side of the lake. I thought that was not going to happen, but what can I say, I don't pass that much time in internet. So, these are little examples of games that did a fine job bringing remasters. However, it is fair to remember when they do not meet expectations. GTA Trilogy, it is an utter shame what happened here. It is not even worth going through the whole mess. Most people out there agree that this is one of the worst cases. What happened in Persona 4 isn't as shameful, but part of the problem is what happened to renderware, the engine that was used. I don't know how it works, but some people point that it is easier to add certain effects like mist and stuff like that. And knowing that EA bought it from Criterion Games to later just throw it into the trash is perhaps another good reason to just stay away from EA. Because thanks to this dumb move, plenty of video games had a lot of problems later. Once again, for the time being, it isn't worth going through all the details, but this is another interesting case to analyze, because while Persona 4 Golden is said to be the definitive edition, unfortunately, that specific artistic execution wasn't brought back. I don't know if I can also blame the directors, because fans have released a patch to fix that issue. But once again, Josh, for the time being, I am not here to promote questionable behavior. There's like 100 people who care for my content. Now, the fact that something says HD in the bots doesn't mean it is going to be good looking, and this is quite persistent in many cases, like Room Factory 4 HD and Resident Evil 4 HD. While there are certain things that got polished, it is also true that you can start to notice where certain models didn't receive that much attention, and this is going to be a similar experience for several remasters, because certain games were designed for really different consoles, but for those who know my general opinion about graphics, this is not that big of a deal, as soon as you can play the game in a good way. But it is unfortunate when entries like Silent Hill HD come out and, well, if Konami wasn't able to preserve the original code, what can I say? As for remakes, both sides of the spectrum also exist. I prefer Twin Snakes, but I won't deny that the first entry OST is way better. Silent Hill 2 Remake is a washed-down version of a modern action game. Resident Evil 2 Remake did a lot of nice things. Sure, it turned into much more action, but the general tension is there. Meanwhile, RE3 Remake simply felt short. The original version of Baroque is simply amazing and crude for what consoles were able to do back then, while the other side of the coin simply killed the ambience. I believe it is worth having these kinds of discussions, of course without turning into brutes trying to defend one side or the other. Despite not liking certain parts of some games, in several cases I had fun, so I still agree that remakes and remasters are a nice way to introduce people into some games. And let's also be honest, sometimes it is hard for me to remember every single line of dialogue, every single detail. Maybe that is the reason why I don't want to see some entries come back. Maybe that is an excuse for me to look for the right way to play these games and share my thoughts with you. It may be nostalgia, or maybe fear for looking at some of these great games chopped in half, just because you cannot say retarded without offending someone. Whatever it may be, tengan poquita madre de no sacar un puñetero juego tras el otro. Ah, Jesus Chrysler.